All right, I want to go over chapter 5, specifically section 5.3. Hopefully everybody has read 5.2, at least that much up to this point. I'm just going to briefly review a couple things here. One of the main concepts in 5.2 was how light travels. Okay, we know light travels in a little particle called a photon, and it's also in a wave pattern. Okay, so these are some terms you're supposed to know. And depending on that wave, so let's just draw a little wave here. Okay. At the crest of each wave, we can actually measure this. All right. And this distance here between each crest of the wave, we call the wavelength. And light we can see, all right, the length of these waves are between 380 nanometers up to 750 nanometers. You can see that I've got the book up here, right here on page 83. Okay, we're on page 83 right now. Section 5.2. And this is important to know because as we're studying chlorophyll, we understand that chlorophyll specifically chlorophyll A, there's a bunch of different types of chlorophyll. Alright, it's the main one though in plants that photosynthesis has to do with. So before we get started on this reaction of photosynthesis, let's make sure we understand the structures it's taking place in. This right here is a plant cell, and that's sort of like the top level. Of what we're studying here. Okay, and then if we zoom in, these little green circles here, that's called a chloroplast. All right, and then if we zoom in on chloroplasts, and you can look at page 85 at the top, you can see there's these double-walled membranes inside of the chloroplast on the outside, and it has an inner membrane that ends up looking like these discs, and this is all one compartment here. They're all connected. Okay, this right here, if we zoom in on one of those, I'll take a disc and I were to just cut it in half, all right, is where this is going to be taking place, and I'm going to signify that by just drawing a straight line. Okay, so this area right here would be called stroma, and it's sort of like it's got a thick cytoplasm where plant DNA is stored and some other things like that. But in terms of this drawing here, you can say this would be the stroma side, and this would be the inner thylakoid space, because this continuous compartment, this inner membrane here, is called a thylakoid membrane. Okay, let me show you a picture of what it's going to look like up close. This is what I'm talking about here. Okay, this would be stroma area, and this would be, I'm sorry, this would be stroma area, and this would be inner thylakoid here. Okay, so this is where photosynthesis takes place. This is where we're going to be studying this section of the course here. All right, you're going to need to spend some time learning what's going on with all these proteins, these electrons, and things like that. Now these words like ATP synthase, photosystem 1, electron transfer chain, don't let that be intimidating to you. ADP, phosphate, you should already kind of be familiar with ATP and ADP. Remember, that's the main energy source of a cell. Synthase, anything that synthesizes something is just making it. So this ATP synthase is a protein that makes ATP. And some of the ingredients for ATP are adenosine diphosphate and then one more phosphate. Remember, this was let's see here, let me back up. So ATP, that stood for triphosphate, meaning it had 3 phosphates on this molecule here. Well, to make ATP, you take an adenosine diphosphate that has 2. You just add 1 to it. Okay? So you already know a little bit about it. Let's recall the equation we had where we took glucose if you think back to chapter 4 on page 67, we talked about an equation where we added glucose. Well, what am I thinking here? If you think back to chapter 4, page 67, we talked about an equation where we took glucose, which had 6 carbon, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen atoms, combined with 2 more oxygen atoms here, or oxygen diatomic molecule. When we break that down in our bodies as human beings, some of the outputs are carbon dioxide, we breathe that off as a waste gas, and water. Okay, so this is the chemical equation for photosynthesis right here. And when you put those together, you get glucose, or starch, or sugar, and oxygen as a byproduct. Okay, we're talking about how that's done up here. So let's make an ingredient list here for photosynthesis, and we'll just find out where this stuff goes. First of all, we've got a water molecule. We need an electron. Okay, we need some hydrogen atoms. We need a few proteins. And these are going to be photosystem 1, photosystem 2. We need something to carry our electrons around when we're done using them, and that's going to be NADP. And once it receives an electron, okay, it's going to be known as NADPH afterwards. And then the results of that are ATP. Okay, that's what we're trying to make with photosynthesis here. That's the result. So let me redraw my section of thylakoid membrane here. Okay, remember, this will be the stroma side, and this is going to be the inner thylakoid membrane side. Okay, you're going to have to know which part of this reaction is happening on which side of this membrane. Okay. So the first thing we need is a system that can capture photons. And we're going to call that Photosystem 2. I learned a long time ago why this one was named 2 instead of 1. I can't remember exactly. Maybe I'll find out for this is over. But this is what actually collects our sun rays, okay? Our photons are coming into this right here. So when photons enter photosystem 2, electrons are released from that water molecule. The oxygen ends up being released as the oxygen we breathe from the cell, the plant cell. For the hydrogen, a concentration gradient is created. As the electron moves down the electron chain, it loses energy until it reaches photosystem 1, where it's re-energized by more photons. This hydrogen up above in the stroma area can't get back across the membrane unless it has energy. It's going against its concentration gradient. The electron provides that for these hydrogen as it travels down the chain. Now this electron has to go somewhere because energy cannot be destroyed or created, right? So an electron acceptor, NADP, comes along and accepts it. This becomes NADPH, which is used later in the light-independent reactions to synthesize glucose. Glucose ends up being stored in the form of starch in plants. So what's going to happen with these hydrogen ions? Well, remember, at this point, they're going from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So they only need passive transport to get back across this membrane. They're going to travel through this ATP synthase, and it's going to harness the flow of these ions across this membrane to spin. And as it spins, it's going to start making ATP, which is also used down the road to make glucose. And that's what you need to know about Chapter 5. Just this first part of photosynthesis is what we're going to cover. I've got a short quiz for you to take after you've watched this video to test your knowledge on it. I would make sure that before we have a final exam, you would come back and revisit it. If you got any questions, I really hope that you will email me or call me or Zoom chat me, and we can go a little more in depth on it. Thank you for sticking through this video, and hope you all have a great week.